Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this session on what successful scale-up founders have in common. And I'm delighted to be joined by Carl Fritjofsson, who's the partner and a partner at Creandum, the European venture capital firm, to discuss this topic. And if anyone's going to be able to tease out what makes a great founder and what successful founders have in common, then it's definitely going to be Carl. So thanks very much for joining us, Carl.
Thank you, Mike. Pleasure to be here.
Fantastic. I mean, so we might as well just jump straight in here. I mean, obviously, you meet many founders. I'm in a privileged position as a journalist with Techcrunch. Oh, and by the way, I should probably introduce myself. Mike Butcher, editor at large for Techcrunch. I nearly forgot to say that.
Everyone knew that, Mike. Come on.
We're in a privileged position, aren't we? You know, we get to meet lots of founders. But, you know, do you see, for instance, patterns between the successful ones versus the kind of mid-range, also rans, as we like to say in the UK, founders? What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, the VCs that are able to actually predict this with high accuracy, I would think that they have something really special. It's incredibly difficult to see this beforehand. We try, of course, we try. In hindsight, is always obvious, but I think one characteristic that kind of stands out more than anything else is that founders need to have this like inherent curiosity around what they're pursuing, that they are constantly trying to like iterate and get more data, learn, challenge themselves, and hence, you know, evolve as a founder as the company scales. And so that's I think is the clearest kind of characteristics that we've seen, that we can try to assess at the early stage when we meet them before it's obvious. So I would think that's the main one. But you know, it's a really difficult job to be a founder of a really successful startup, because you have to evolve so many times over, right? The first job, generally, when you're a couple of people in a garage, kind of the iconic startup scenario, over Zoom these days probably. But then you're really close to the market, you're close to product. That's kind of, you're very hands-on, right? And then you enter phase 2 of a startup journey, which tends to be kind of mobilizing your product market fit that you've established with people that can execute that for you. So you turn into kind of a hiring guru, and that's the main role of the founder. And then at a certain point of time, let's say around 80, 100 people or something like that, you tend to have now an executive management team, and you go to like become much more reliant upon others to do the job. You get much more distance from the actual micro decisions in the business, and you rather try to create some kind of a management and reporting organization. And it's a completely different type of mindset that you need to have at that stage. And then eventually, you know, if the company continues to succeed and you now suddenly 1,000 people plus, suddenly you become like this kind of 5-year time horizon, pure visionary, just North Star leader, right? And all these things, you know, there's a reason why management churn through because of the stages that a company goes through, because some people aren't necessarily interested and skilled to kind of rise to the occasion across that entire value chain. But yeah, the ones that are, they are exceptional, and it's you know, it's a true privilege to see it happen when we do.
Are you the sort of the view that a founder can basically acquire some of those success skills before they do a company, or is it something that is it innate, or is it something you have to learn on the job, as it were? What's your view?
I think it's very difficult to learn it beforehand, because the reality is that the founder role is so complex, and you can't fully understand and grasp it by consuming literature and just speaking to others. You have to really feel it. And so I think it's hard to teach yourself that. But I don't think this is something that you're born with and it's like part of your DNA code, or is not. I definitely think that this is something that a lot of founders, with the right circumstances, can seize that opportunity and kind of step up to that. But you know, the founder journey is such a psychological roller coaster. So a lot of the times it just comes back to that core, that core, you know, grit and tenacity, and whether or not you really feel that you have the energy to continue to pursue and just push onwards. And sometimes you get that energy because the problem that you're solving is something that you inherently really care about. But sometimes you get that energy just because of the sheer fact that you are in the lucky position that you have a startup that's working and it's growing, and you kind of you just feed off the energy of like, what's ahead of me as an operator of this company? What do I need to create in order for this company to succeed in the next phase? And that, I think this, you know, you can get the motivation to kind of find that curiosity and find that iterative nature that is needed during this cycle. But I think your life has to kind of match what the company is going through in a lot of sense. And so what I mean to say is, I think there are certain founders that wouldn't have been as successful in another startup. It wasn't that they were just naturally the best operator. It was just that they had some kind of inherent reason why this company at this point in time in their life really made sense for them to really scale to the opportunity.
But there's surely some practical skills that you can teach yourself. For instance, I mean, you're not going to be successful if you don't stay on top of the market that you're addressing, right? So that's a practical skill. Check in on the news, check tech meme, check in on, you know, Google alerts about your competitors or whatever else you're doing. I mean, there's a real simple, practical base level things anyone could do, right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, if we're talking about kind of generalist skill set, I would think there's two key skill sets that any founder needs, regardless of what stage that kind of company is scaling through. And it's a real black belt in terms of people skills, and the other one is sales skills. And what I mean with people is that you need to learn how to trust people. You need to learn how to evaluate people. You need to learn how to motivate people. And this is not, of course, not only your only team members. This is also customers. It's journalists like Mike Butcher. It's investors like Carl. There's so many people around you in the ecosystem that you need to kind of learn how to maneuver and get on your team. And the flip side is kind of selling to all these entities, right, throughout this entire cycle. So you're more or less always hiring and you're always selling your business at any point of time. And when I say that, I think a lot of people start getting nervous that this is a job that only extroverts can do, which is not the case, right? To sell doesn't mean you have to be a showman. You scream from the top of your lungs. You can sell in a lot of different subtle ways, and it doesn't mean you have to stand at the center of the stage at all times and just steer the troops in that way. So, but I think that those are kind of the two core elements of like understanding your market enough that you can extract the real story that people can mobilize around, and then get as many people, whether to join your team or to buy your services around that.
I'm really glad that you said that, because I think there's a big misconception that founders have to be this huge extrovert, over the top kind of a character to be successful. And I think for my money, I think it's much more about being the kind of person who can educate, but also bring people along with them on the journey. Right. And, you know, educate and motivate in a positive way, not necessarily just, do a big kind of Steve Jobs presentation and then walk off stage left, off the stage. I think that's a big
no doubt.
And
no doubt. And I think there's there are many different ways that you could get people excited about what you're doing. And one could be that you're a showman or showwoman and just do that kind of spiel, right? But other thing could be that you're just extremely technically savvy or insightful about a market that you're pursuing and a problem that you're solving. And in itself, because you're one of the deepest thinker of that problem, it means a lot of people care about what you have to say and they get motivated about what you're doing. So there are many different reasons why people will stand behind and follow you through the kind of pains and tribulations that a startup means. But I do think that regardless if you're an introvert or extrovert, you have to have some kind of a star quality, for lack of a better word, that gets people really rallied behind you, right? And this is something you could create, right? You could manufacture that star quality. You don't have to be born with it. That's what I'm saying here.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. What about? Do you see a difference between the kind of founder who's the founder of a unicorn and the kind of founder who's the founder of a very great successful company, but not one of the kind of the billion dollar kind of unicorn kind of company? Do you think there's a different sort of a special sauce to those kinds of founders that's different?
I do believe that there is a difference in founders when a company reaches a certain scale, in terms of, do you continue to have the hunger to kind of constantly change and evolve, or do you somehow get like at peace with what has been created? And because creating a company that, a SaaS company that does 10, 20 million ARR is an incredible achievement, right? I mean, few people could ever even dream of achieving something like that. But you're pretty far away from somewhat of a unicorn status even at that stage. But you've already almost accomplished the impossible at that stage. But the founders that really still have that hunger, and they're like, they just look forward. They constantly think forward and look at everyone around them themselves and just challenge what they're doing, never accepting the status quo, and just continue to push forward. It's obvious when you look at the unicorn type of founders that that's what they have, and it's not obvious all the time when you see these kind of good success cases, but they kind of flatten out at a certain point in time, whether the founders really still have that hunger and drive to innovate and continue.
There's a lot of talk about when a startup raises money, suddenly you're awash with funds, etc. Is it important that founders are frugal with that money, or I presume that investors would say yes, but the question is like, how frugal are you going to be? Is it really about deploying that money immediately, or is it holding it back, or what are the kinds of decisions that successful founders make that makes that fundraising moment work?
I believe that it's not necessarily about being frugal. It's about being thoughtful in your spend and close the loop on that spend at any point of time, right? So you invest in something, customer acquisition, engineering, product, whatever it is, and you close the loop in terms of what did we learn from this and how did we now improve as an organization. So you manage your cost by running a very tight ship in terms of making sure that every spend that you do is thoughtful, measured, and somehow you reflect upon it afterwards to see whether you achieve the success or not. So we at Creandum, we invest into Creandum invests into companies with the purpose for those companies to spend that money, right? And what we're expecting from that is growth. That's fundamentally the output of that spend, right? So reckless spend without growth, that's a tough equation to have. So what a lot of early stage founders sometimes do when they raise the first round of capital is that they have built some kind of product, they have a few first early users or customers, and then they raise some capital and they want to deploy that into customer acquisition and marketing. So they just waste money out into this kind of black box of which is marketing that you can spend more or less endless within, and they don't really understand the growth levers that they have or have not, and they really don't understand what the expectation of that spend is. So I think you have to, like, once you raise that first amount of capital, you have to be really cautious around where you deploy that money in order for it to actually achieve the growth trajectory that you ideally had in mind. So I think that's fundamentally what it's about. And as if we're thinking about kind of the scale up journey here, I mean, obviously the longer into a company's life cycle that they raise capital, the more of this whole machine do they have identified? And what differentiates a Series A company versus a Series D company is really that they have so high predictability in terms of their unit economics and their growth engine. Right? Money comes in here, revenue comes out here, gross margin, even gross profit, and everything there is. And the more predictable and kind of locked in that is, the more mature the company is. And that's generally the fundamental difference, because a lot of these companies, once they start scaling up, all of them have some kind of inherent product market fit. But how long does that scale? How much capital can you deploy into that with predictable outcomes? That's the biggest question mark.
There's some obvious examples of very driven and founders. Mark Zuckerberg, of course, famously driven. Many other examples, of course. Are there founders that you've come across or read about, whether you've met them or not, that you know of that sort of buck the trend, that aren't your typical, incredibly driven, thoughtful person, that that are just different, more I don't know, don't fit the normal mold of maybe a successful tech founder? Have you come across that at all?
Well, maybe to some extent. The three Klarna founders, they all came out of business school, and they were not associated to the tech ecosystem in any shape or form really during the first couple of years. They used an external agency to build the initial product and gave out quite a bit of equity to those for that, and they didn't realize kind of the power of technology and eventually all the data that Klarna is collecting in order to make the whole experience just so seamless. So I think that's a company that, if you look at their kind of trajectory and their DNA, I think it evolved and changed quite dramatically from where it started to what that company is today, which is very product engineering focused these days, right? But again, I think unfortunately, I don't have a good example of the founders that doesn't really fit the script here, because if you look at Sebastian, the CEO there, he is such a curious mind, and he really has all those characteristics that we just talked about in terms of just continuously challenging himself and evolving and understanding that the business needs something dramatically different today than it did yesterday. And so he still, I think, carries that with him, and he's turned into a technologist, even though he came from far from that, so to speak.
Yeah, I think probably it's a different kind of breed of founder. Perhaps I'm thinking of the kind of founder maybe that does a kind of growth journey to a startup rather than a venture capital led directory. But unfortunately, that's all we have time for. It's 35 minutes past the hour, and we've used up our allotted minutes for this session. But I want to say thank you very much to Carl Fritjofsson, from Creandum, and from me, Mike Butcher from Techcrunch. Thanks very much for joining us for this session.
Thanks, Mike.